Did you know that 1 million more people voted against Abraham Lincoln than voted for him when he was elected president? Or that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave? Or that Lincoln threatened to resign rather than free the slaves of the South? For answers to these and many, many more interesting and amazing facts on Abraham Lincoln, stay tuned for this week's episode on Abraham Lincoln here at Strange As It Seems. And once again, with so much information in the file, let's break this into 2 episodes. In today's episode, we'll tackle first the era of John Hix from 1928 to about 1944. Let's dive in. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hix, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hix, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. Recently, we did an episode on some amazing stories about George Washington, our 8th president, not our first, as I also illuminated. Check that episode out if that sounds like a curious fact to you. But as I was digging through the archives recently, I came across another folder on Abraham Lincoln. And I thought, hey, let's do an episode on all the strange and unusual facts about one of our most famous and endearing presidents, Abraham Lincoln. Which reminds me of one of my favorite jokes of all time. What did George Washington and Abraham Lincoln have in common? Well, they both had beards, except for George Washington. Speaking of Abraham Lincoln's beard, a couple of interesting and unusual facts that you may or may not know. But Abraham Lincoln's beard, he actually started out as a politician without a beard. In fact, here's a painting of Lincoln as he was a politician before being elected president. And apparently, during the campaign of 1860, a little girl wrote him and said she thought he would look better with a beard. In fact, her name is Grace Bedell. Out of Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York. She wrote Lincoln a letter and said, "Dear sir, my father has just come home from the fair and brought home your picture and Mr. Hamlin's. I'm a little girl, only 11 years old, but want you to be president of the United States very much, so I hope you won't think me very bold to write to such a great man as you are. I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway. And if you will let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you." Lincoln wrote her back, and sure enough, grew out a beard that he is known for, and really amazing, but he only wore that beard for 4.5 years of his life, really. His entire life, he looked very much like this, kind of gaunt, thin in the face, and it was really the iconic image we have of Abraham Lincoln we owe to a little 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell. And I also have the article my family clipped in 1941 where the woman who told Lincoln to grow beard dies when Grace Bedell passed away in 1941. And going back into the files too, I found the oldest article in the files, which I didn't find a comic strip attached, but from 1926, a pamphlet called Abraham Lincoln, the Great Emancipator, presented by the John Hancock Life Insurance Company. Amazing, and it looked like one fact that was highlighted in here. I didn't find it in any of the comic strips, but Lincoln's apparently obtained the position of assistant surveyor to John Calhoun, who was then surveyor of the county that Lincoln lived in, and apparently he was appointed the local postmaster, and because the mails were small and infrequent, he carried the office around in his hat. Strange as it seems, but a beautiful little 1926 pamphlet on Abraham Lincoln in the archives. And here's a clipping from the Gilmore Cub publication. John Hix featured all the presidents in these Gilmore Cub newspaper editions that went out. In fact, this map of California came from one of those Gilmore Cub publications, but this is the one on Lincoln, and a really interesting fact here about Lincoln and how he was really chosen by the newly formed Republican Party in 1860. They were afraid to nominate their favorite, who was William Seward at the time. They thought his political prominence endangered his chances of election, and they cast their nominating votes for Lincoln, the country lawyer, who with his honesty, his sincerity, and his awkward friendly frankness, they thought had a chance to win. And then I guess Seward was appointed to Lincoln's cabinet, and he wrote to the president and he suggested that he attend all the matters of state and that Lincoln amuse himself as best he could performing the less important functions of the office. But fascinating fact here by Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet member William Seward. And I found this too. I'd heard these coincidences before somewhere. I never had seen them in the Strange as It Seems archives, but I did find this dropped. I don't know if we ever featured it in a comic strip or not, but fascinating coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy. Lincoln was elected in 1860. Kennedy was elected in 1960. Both of them were slain on a Friday, and both in the presence of their wives. Their successors, both named Johnson, were Southerners, both were Democrats, and both had previously served in the U.S. Senate. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839, and Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Both Booth and Oswald were murdered before trial could be arranged. They were both Southerners who favored unpopular ideas. And the wives of both Lincoln and Kennedy lost children through death while residing in the White House. Lincoln's secretary, whose name was Kennedy, advised him not to go to the theater, and Kennedy's secretary, whose name was Lincoln, advised him not to go to Dallas. Extraordinary coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy, strange as it seems. And I found this as well, which just about knocked me out of my chair when I saw a handwritten letter from Abe Lincoln to John Hix. Crazy enough, right? And turns out there was an Abe Lincoln, at least he called himself Abe Lincoln. His name was really Lynn Lincoln, and he claimed to be the fifth cousin, I think, looking like Abe Lincoln too. There's some pictures of him. I guess he appeared in a court hearing, some kind of traffic violation or something. This popped up in 1934 in the Los Angeles Examiner and the LA Times, and John Hix looked like about to feature it. And then got these letters back and forth from Abe Lincoln, crazy enough, and it basically was trying to get John Hix to pay him money. I guess that's why nothing showed of it. He said, the best offer you can make me, if I can't live on photos, I have to work for my living. Assume as you do. If you can better let me hear from you. So apparently Abe Lincoln here was trying to work John Hix over for some money to be featured in Strange as It Seems, and as it turns out, it doesn't look like he was. So let's dive into the John Hix era of comic strips on Abraham Lincoln. And I see here the first one from 1930, that two presidents of the United States, Jefferson and Lincoln, were not members of any church. And this fact that we alluded to already appeared several times in Strange as It Seems, beginning, it looks like, in 1936, but that Lincoln lost his race for the Senate with a majority vote. Crazy enough, but he won the presidential election in 1860 when more people voted against him than for him. Crazy. When Abraham Lincoln ran for the Senate in 1858, he lost the election in spite of the fact that more votes were cast for him than for his opponents. Douglas, his opponent, carried a greater number of districts, and that's why he was elected. And then in the presidential election of 1860, more people voted against him than voted for him. And in spite of it, he won. Lincoln polled a greater number of votes than any one of his opponents, but together they polled over 900,000 more votes, almost 1 million more votes than Lincoln. So out of approximately 4.6 million votes, Lincoln got 1.8 million, while his opponents got almost 2.8 million. Crazy, amazing facts about Abraham Lincoln and his elections to both Senate and presidency in 1860. And here's a fact that apparently was challenged quite a bit by the Strange as It Seems readership, but it started, looks like, the first time in 1935, but and then again in 1937. But John Hix published the fact that more books had been written about Abraham Lincoln, more than any other man except Christ. And this ran again, I think even in 1944, and prompted a letter like this. Dear Sir, I've read your cartoons in the weekly papers and also the dailies, and I've enjoyed the most of them. Once in a while, you've written things I hardly believed, but in your cartoon in the Long Beach Press Telegram for Sunday, July 23rd, 1944, I know definitely that you are in error when you say that there have been more books written about Abraham Lincoln than any other man except Christ. I ask you to read and look into the many thousands of books written for and against Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. Why, in the Salt Lake City, Utah Public Library, there's some 10,000 books and pamphlets about this man alone, thousands more than about Washington, the father of our country. And it looks like John Hix did put together and send the proof. In fact, we even have a letter here from the Library of Congress and another one from the Librarian of Congress, the superintendent of the reading room, to back up the proof that Lincoln was indeed the most written about man except for Christ, at least through the era of Strange as It Seems. And a fact that's probably widely known, but maybe not by everyone, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was actually not the principal oration delivered at the dedication of the Gettysburg battlefield. The principal address was actually by Edward Everett of Massachusetts, who apparently went on and on and on, and Lincoln got up, gave a very short address, became one of the most famous speeches in history. And I love this too. In the Patriot in Union of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the speech was accounted for in this manner. We pass over the silly remarks of the president for the credit of the nation. We are willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them, and that they shall no more be repeated and thought of. So highly criticized speech that became one of the most famous speeches in American history. Strange as it seems. You know, I went to Gettysburg once with my father and visited the battlefield. It always amazed me how many Civil War battles were fought on U.S. national park sites. And here's a fact that came from William Last, the managing editor of the United Feature Syndicate. Interesting letter, too. This is in 1939 when John Hix had scooped Ripley for a spot at the New York World's Fair. And in fact, I've got some old video footage I found of that. I'll have to dig up somewhere showing John Hix on stage, but pretty funny. He makes a little comment in here along with the fact that he delivered about Lincoln, but he said, I've been visiting your show at the fair off and on, and frankly, I don't think it's going to really pack him in without certain changes in policy. For one thing, the 40-cent tariff is too high, with everyone else charging a quarter. The expenses are so great for visiting the fair that 15 cents means a lot to most of the people. Kind of interesting, but the fact that he served up and John Hix published was actually a military grave for Abraham Lincoln, strangely enough, but it was here is buried James Summerfield Staples, who basically substituted for the president as a private in the U.S. Army. Apparently, Lincoln had basically said that he really wished he could fight in the war, or that he felt like he should be fighting on the front lines of the war. And a J. Summerfield Staples reached out to him, and here's actually a photograph of Summerfield Staples' grave. Substitute for Abraham Lincoln, died in 1888. A fascinating fact there about J. Summerfield Staples. And an interesting but little known fact that honest Abe Lincoln was once challenged to a duel and met his opponent on the field of honor. The opponent basically accused him of telling a lie, and they both had swords drawn. Apparently had to do something with a lady's name, that it was an affair of honor with regard to a lady. And the arrangements were made. They met. They named the weapons, which were cavalry swords. The two men met on a sandbar in the Mississippi River near the town of Alton, and they prepared for battle. And just as they were about to start, apparently several cool-headed friends from both arrived, halted the proceedings, and managed to get them to laugh off the affair, and they parted the best of friends. Another little-known fact that Abraham Lincoln once christened a town called Lincoln. This is before he was elected president. It was the only community in the United States elsewhere named for Abraham Lincoln before he became president. It was Lincoln, Illinois. And apparently he christened the town with a watermelon. Lincoln warned when they tried to name the town after him. He goes, "I don't believe I'd do that, gentlemen. I've never knew anything named Lincoln that ever amounted to much." Again, before he became president. And basically, during public sale of lots on the town site, Lincoln purchased a watermelon, which he divided with the proprietors, and he let a few drops of melon juice fall on the ground, and he said, "Now the town is duly christened Lincoln, Illinois." And in proof of the fact of Lincoln, Illinois, I do have an actual handwritten or hand-signed letter from John Hix that was actually sent back with a note at the bottom, along with the City of Lincoln, Illinois pamphlet here, and how the town was named. Fascinating stuff here in the Strange As It Seems archives. And an interesting parallel between two great men of the era, between Darwin and Lincoln, two of the greatest men of the 19th century. They were both born on the same day. Amazing. They both came into prominence in the same year, which was 1859, right, when Lincoln was elected and then became president in 1860. And this is also when Darwin published The Origin of the Species, and both men died in the same month of April. Interestingly enough, Darwin and Lincoln living parallel lives. And going back to 1935, little known fact that Abraham Lincoln was once a champion wrestler. Met and threw all comers in and about Spencer County, Illinois. Great champion wrestler, Abraham Lincoln. And speaking of the Gettysburg Address, apparently the "of the people, by the people, and for the people" was actually not an original expression from Lincoln. He might have ripped it off from, looks like Daniel Webster, in his celebrated reply to Hayne, emphasized government made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. So that might have been more Daniel Webster than Abraham Lincoln. And there were actually 3 plots to assassinate Lincoln even before he was inaugurated. Crazy. In fact, hand grenades were found aboard the inaugural train, and it was also discovered that Orsini, an Italian, was in on the plot to assassinate Lincoln. So apparently, lots of assassination plots and aborted attempts before the success of John Wilkes Booth. And I found this fact particularly fascinating, but Lincoln apparently threatened to resign as president rather than free the slaves of the South. This is in 1861. And basically, he was disagreeing with the demands that the slaves be freed without compensation to their owners. Crazy. It was basically he was against freeing the slaves without state compensation to their owners, as the District of Columbia paid. A great group of Northerners favored freeing them without compensation to the owners, and another faction favored making the slaves fight for their freedom. When David Hunter issued his proclamation freeing the slaves of 3 states, Lincoln declared it void and appealed to the border states again to free their slaves by buying their freedom. Fairly staggered in 1861, Lincoln was under the insistent demands of the group, and he actually threatened to resign as president over it. Strange as it seems. And this appeared again in the era of Ernest Hicks, how Lincoln wanted to pay the South $400 million, apparently, to compensate for the slaves, but his cabinet turned down the proposal unanimously. And the final actual drawing of Abraham Lincoln, and I looked at this and I thought, this did not look like the artwork of John Hix. And then I realized this was from July 23rd, 1944, which would have been about a month after John Hix died. And although his signature was still at the bottom and they still ran it as if it was being run by John Hix, this was probably Doug Hayes, I think, was the artist that took over after John Hix. But one final in the John Hix era representation of Lincoln that actually was not drawn by John Hix a month after he passed away.